Beneath the layers of official history lies a shadowed chapter the world has almost forgotten. The legend of a lost civilization known as the Tartarian Empire. For centuries, maps drawn by the hands of skilled European cartographers marked its vast dominion, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Its name appeared boldly, its borders undeniable. Yet, in a blink of historical time, it vanished, erased not by the slow decay of centuries, but as if deliberately struck from the record. What could cause an empire of such scale to disappear so completely? Were the Tartarians simply a misunderstood collection of nomadic tribes, or an advanced civilization whose knowledge, architecture, and very existence threatened the powers that followed? From buried cities and unexplained architectural marvels to whispered tales of giants and mysterious global disasters, the clues are scattered, waiting for curious minds to piece them together. Tonight, we dim the lights and let the quiet of the night draw us into a deeper mystery. Rest your thoughts, open your imagination, and join us as we drift through time to uncover what history tried to hide. Welcome to Historic Sleep. Your journey begins here. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The first time you hear the name Tartaria, it sounds like a half-forgotten place from an old sailor's tale, one of those strange lands that exist on the edges of antique maps, where cartographers let their ink wander into the unknown. But in truth, Tartaria was not an invention of rumor or myth, at least not in the eyes of the people who lived between the 1500s and 1800s. Back then, anyone who unfolded a detailed European map would have seen it plainly, a vast empire stretching like a great shadow across Eurasia. The words Grand Tartary were not hidden in a corner. They were written boldly across territories that seemed to defy the limits of geography, from the icy reaches of Siberia down into the warmer valleys of Central Asia, from the steppes near the Caspian Sea all the way to the Pacific Ocean's far horizon. It wasn't just one country. Some maps showed Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, even independent Tartary, hinting at a complex political reality inside an even greater whole. French mapmakers agreed with the Dutch, who agreed with the Germans, who in turn matched the English, a rare consensus in a world where borders were usually drawn as much from ambition as from fact. Yet, somewhere in the 19th century, Tartaria disappeared, not fading slowly like an empire in decline, but vanishing as if someone had decided to erase it overnight. The maps stopped showing its name. The atlases gave no mention of its people. Geography books treated it as if it had never existed. And in its place, there was silence. What could cause something so large to vanish so completely? Most of us can imagine the collapse of kingdoms, invasions, famine, plague, but even in ruin, traces remain. Stones crumble into ruins that can still be measured. Languages leave behind loanwords in the tongues of the conquerors. Stories linger in the memory of villages. But here, it seemed different. The erasure was too clean, too deliberate. No grand farewell, no slow disintegration. Just absence. And when absence is that sudden, people begin to ask questions. One of the first places they looked was the architecture of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The government buildings, train stations, and monumental halls that appeared in European and American cities as if conjured from another age. Massive stone facades, ornate domes, intricate colonnades, built, according to official history, in astonishingly short spans of time. Structures that even modern engineers admit would take decades to construct were allegedly raised in just a few years, sometimes even less. San Francisco, 1906, a city reduced to rubble by an earthquake and fire, yet somehow rebuilt with jaw-dropping architecture in what seemed like the blink of an eye. Chicago, 1893, the world's Columbian Exposition, known as the White City, covering over 600 acres with monumental neoclassical structures said to have been built in only 2 years. The official explanation claimed they were temporary, made of plaster and wood. But photographs show something different. Buildings that look permanent, solid, crafted with precision. And then, in an odd twist, these so-called temporary masterpieces were torn down almost immediately after the events they were built for. The reason? They were never meant to last. It is a curious logic, to spend such effort and resources on something only to destroy it. Unless, as some have suggested, they weren't built for those events at all. Here is where the first whispers of the Tartarian theory take root. What if these buildings had been here long before the fairs and exhibitions? What if they were remnants of a civilization far more advanced than the world was willing to admit? A civilization whose architecture, technology, and sheer scale challenged the official narrative of progress? And what if, once those in power decided such a history was inconvenient, these buildings were either demolished or rebranded as recent creations, their true origins quietly buried? It sounds like the stuff of conspiracy, and perhaps it is. But then you walk the streets of certain older cities and notice something strange. Entire first floors hidden below street level, windows staring out from beneath the pavement, doors that open into the ground itself. In Seattle, they call it the underground. In New York, during subway construction, workers have uncovered walls and chambers far below the modern city. The official answer is urban development, streets being raised over time. Yet in many places, the depth is too great, the uniformity too widespread, and the style of the buried levels too refined to dismiss entirely. For those who believe in the Tartarian connection, this is the mud flood, a global disaster in the 1800s that buried cities and civilizations under thick layers of soil and debris, leaving only the upper floors visible. The theory grows from here, drawing connections between architectural similarities across continents, the sudden erasure of an empire from historical maps, and the curious lack of photographic evidence for the construction of supposedly modern buildings. Skeptics call it romantic nonsense. Believers call it the greatest cover-up in human history. And somewhere between those two views lies a set of facts that are difficult to ignore. Maps that once agreed on Tartaria's existence, architectural marvels built too quickly, city plans altered too thoroughly, and silences in the historical record too loud to be natural. So, was Tartaria real? Or is it just a mirage born from misread maps and human longing for lost golden ages? Tonight, we begin our search not with an answer, but with a question that stretches from the parchment of old maps to the stone facades of forgotten buildings, from the quiet streets above to the hidden floors below. A question that invites us to walk slowly, to look closely, and to listen for the echoes of a past the world decided we should forget. If you were to step into the mind of a European cartographer in the late 16th century, you would find yourself hunched over a large sheet of parchment, the air heavy with the smell of ink and candle wax. Before you, continents unfold under your pen, coastlines curling like ancient scars, mountains drawn as sharp triangular teeth, and here, across the wide heart of Asia, a name you write in firm, deliberate strokes. Tartaria Magna, Grand Tartary. It's not a whimsical flourish, not a mythical sea monster sketched to fill empty space, but the mark of a land known, spoken of, and traded with. Sailors, traders, and emissaries had whispered tales of it for centuries. Its borders might shift in the imagination, but its presence was certain enough to be inked on maps for over 300 years. And then, as if on cue, the name begins to fade from those same maps, until there is nothing left but the empty space where it once commanded the page. It is tempting to think this is just how history works. Empires rise, empires fall, yet the pattern here is unnerving. Tartaria does not die a slow, documented death. It does not leave behind the ordinary trail of defeat. No treaties, no chronicles of its last kings, no heroic laments sung in exile. It simply ceases to be drawn, ceases to be taught, ceases to be spoken of in polite academic circles. And in its place, the official narrative fills the vacuum with other stories. The rise of the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty's consolidation, the European scramble for influence in Central Asia. Tartaria becomes a ghost with no grave. But ghosts have a way of leaving traces. One of the most striking lies not in books or maps, but in stone. Across the 19th century Western world, cities erupted with a sudden abundance of monumental architecture. Not just large, but impossibly large. Not just beautiful, but engineered with such precision and scale that modern experts still marvel. Courthouses crowned with intricate domes, city halls flanked by colonnades of flawless symmetry, railway stations that could swallow entire neighborhoods within their cavernous interiors. The official line was that these were the triumphs of the industrial age, the product of steel, steam, and human ambition. Yet the timelines given for their construction were so short, so compressed, they seemed to mock the laws of labor and logistics. 2 years here, 3 years there, to build what would today take decades. And then there is the curious case of the world's fairs, grand expositions that appeared like glittering mirages in the last decades of the 1800s and the first of the 1900s. Chicago in 1893, Paris in 1900, St. Louis in 1904, San Francisco in 1915. Each was said to be built from scratch, vast swaths of land transformed into cities of wonder almost overnight, filled with palaces of fine arts, temples to industry, and sprawling exhibition halls. The official records insist many were made of temporary materials, designed to be dismantled. Yet photographs show an architectural permanence, a mastery of stone and iron that hardly matches the idea of cheap and temporary. When the fairs ended, the bulldozers came, reducing these marvels to rubble as quickly as they had risen. It was as though someone had borrowed them from another time and, having used them, returned them to the void. For those who believe in the Tartarian connection, these were not temporary showpieces at all, but surviving fragments of that lost civilization, cleaned up and repurposed to impress the public, then destroyed to keep their true origin hidden. And perhaps the most tantalizing evidence of all lies not in what was built above ground, but in what is buried below it. In city after city, Old structures are found sunk deep beneath the current street level, their original entrances choked with soil, their windows peering out from what is now darkness. Seattle's famous underground tour leads visitors through such spaces, the remains of a street level that no longer exists. In New York, in Paris, in London, during subway construction or renovation, crews have stumbled upon rooms and passageways that no modern blueprint remembers. The official explanation is the slow layering of urban development, streets repaved higher over time, foundations built over, levels lost in the march of centuries. But the so-called mud flood theory offers a different vision, that sometime in the 1800s, a massive global event, whether earthquake, deluge, or something stranger still, swept across cities, burying entire floors in mud and debris. Those who survived built on top of what remained, leaving the hidden lower levels as mute witnesses to a catastrophe no one speaks of. And strangely, this supposed disaster aligns eerily with the time Tartaria vanished from the maps. If the mud flood happened, it could explain why the buried architecture shares such remarkable similarities in style across continents. The same grand arches, the same stone patterns, the same sense of proportion. It could explain why photographs from the late 1800s sometimes show city streets eerily empty, as though life itself had not yet returned to them. The skeptics call these coincidences, products of long camera exposures and architectural fashion. But when enough coincidences pile high enough, they begin to look like a pattern. And so the question deepens. Was Tartaria simply a cartographic mistake, a phantom born of outdated geography? Or was it a real empire, one whose cities, knowledge, and perhaps even people were swallowed by a disaster, and then by a cover-up? For those who have walked through the echoing chambers of old stone halls, who have stood before doors far taller than any person has need for, who have traced their fingers over the cold curves of a column and felt the hum of something older than the city itself. The answer does not come easily. They speak of a feeling hard to name, like standing at the edge of a vast shadow you can see, but never fully enter. And it is in that shadow that we will continue to walk, step by careful step, looking for what remains of a world the history books forgot to remember. Imagine walking into a building so vast that your footsteps echo for seconds before fading, the sound swallowed by domes that seem to float high above you like pale stone clouds. The first thing you notice is not the silence, but the scale. Doorways rise twice your height. Staircases stretch in wide, shallow steps that force you to take an extra stride to climb each one. Even the furniture, if any remains, feels oversized. Chairs that keep your feet from touching the ground. Tables broad enough to seat a dozen without crowding. At first, you might think it's a trick of the architect's ego, a way to inspire awe by making humans feel small. But what if it wasn't built for humans your size at all? The theory takes a leap here, one that even some believers hesitate to make. Tartaria, they say, was not just an advanced civilization. It was a civilization of giants. Not the metaphorical kind, not the political giants of history, but literal beings of extraordinary height and proportion. Look closely at photographs of certain grand buildings from the late 1800s and early 1900s, and you may see the clues. Arches 20 feet tall for interior doorways, windows stretching far beyond the reach of any ordinary ladder. ceilings that make even a cathedral feel modest. These are not just flourishes. They are functional dimensions, scaled to bodies larger than our own. Mainstream history explains these as aesthetic choices, born from traditions like neoclassicism, which borrowed the monumental proportions of ancient Rome and Greece. But then come the accounts, newspaper clippings from the 1800s reporting the discovery of human skeletons standing 8 or 9 feet tall, found during mining operations or construction projects across America. Reports filed, sometimes even photographed, then quietly disappearing into institutional archives. The Smithsonian, according to the theory, was not a neutral keeper of history, but an active participant in erasing it, confiscating the remains, and sealing them away from public view. Officially, such skeletons never existed. Unofficially, the stories are too numerous, too geographically widespread, to dismiss entirely. If the Tartarians were giants, their architecture makes more sense. Their steps would fit the broad stairs. Their hands could grasp the tall door handles without strain. Their eyes could look out through high windows without needing to crane their necks. The idea pushes against every conventional timeline of human evolution, yet it finds strange companions in myth and folklore. The Bible's Nephilim, the Greek Titans, the Norse Jötnar, the enormous warriors of Native American oral tradition, all speak of a time when beings larger and stronger than ourselves walked the earth. We are taught to treat these as allegories, but the question lingers. What if they are memories? And if they were memories, then the vanishing of Tartaria might have been more than the loss of an empire. It might have been the deliberate removal of a people. Here the theory grows darker. The late 1800s and early 1900s were marked by a string of catastrophic events, fires, earthquakes, pandemics, and wars, that, taken separately, appear tragic but random. But together, to those looking through the lens of the Tartarian hypothesis, they form a suspicious pattern. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed the city's most ornate buildings, but spared simpler wooden structures. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake flattened entire districts, yet somehow targeted many of the grandest stone edifices. The devastation of World War I wiped out not just people, but centuries of architecture in Europe's heart. Each disaster, in its own way, seemed to clear the physical traces of something older. There is another detail, subtle but unsettling, in the photographic record from this period. Look at street scenes of major cities from the 1880s to the early 1900s. Many are eerily empty. Long avenues with no carriages, public squares without a soul in sight, rows of grand facades without the bustle that should animate them. The common explanation is the long exposure time of early cameras, which caused moving objects, people, horses, carts, to blur into invisibility. But even so, should every person in a city be moving all at once? Should there not be at least a few figures caught in stillness, leaning on a wall, standing in conversation, gazing at the lens? The emptiness begins to feel less like a quirk of photography, and more like a glimpse into a moment when the streets truly were deserted. Some take this as evidence of a depopulation event, perhaps the aftermath of the mud flood, perhaps a pandemic more devastating than recorded, perhaps even a coordinated removal of the Tartarian people themselves. In this reading, the emptiness of the streets is not artistic accident, but unguarded truth, a fraction of history captured before the story could be rewritten. But even if such events did happen, The question remains, why erase them? Why not weave the Tartarians into the accepted flow of history, as has been done with countless other conquered or assimilated peoples? The more radical answer is control. If the Tartarians possessed technology beyond what was supposed to exist, free energy drawn from the earth and air, sound frequencies capable of moving stone, architectural principles that harnessed natural forces, then acknowledging them would undermine the narrative of human progress. It would suggest that modern civilization is not the peak of achievement, but a pale echo of something greater, something we have lost. And if the Tartarians were giants, the implications would go deeper still, striking at the core of human self-image. We are taught that we are the measure of all things, that our size and shape are the default for intelligent life. To admit otherwise would be to admit that we live in a world built partly for others, taller others whose needs and capabilities were not our own. It would mean rethinking evolution, history, even the boundaries of what we consider human. These are the ideas that keep the Tartarian theory alive, not because they are proven, but because they are compelling. They weave together architecture, archaeology, myth, and mystery into a single haunting thread. And once you begin to pull on that thread, it is hard to stop because it does not unravel neatly. It winds through buried streets and empty photographs, through maps with missing names and buildings that feel too large for their inhabitants, through rumors of bones that no museum will show you. And somewhere in the winding, you begin to sense that the story of Tartaria, whatever it truly was, is less about what we can prove and more about what we are willing to see. And so the trail continues, deeper into the shadows of the past, where fact and legend trade places, and every discovery leads to another question. If the mystery of Tartaria were only about old maps and strange architecture, perhaps it could be dismissed as a curiosity, an odd but harmless footnote in the margins of history. But the deeper you go, the more it begins to feel like a puzzle built to be unsolvable, with pieces scattered across continents, hidden in plain sight, or locked away where no one can reach them. You start to notice patterns not just in buildings, but in the way certain histories are told. And, more importantly, in the way certain histories are not told at all. One of the most unsettling threads in the tapestry is the connection to the great world's fairs and expositions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These events were celebrated as showcases of modern progress, yet their very scale and speed raise more questions than they answer. Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition, for example, sprawled across more than 600 acres, with over 200 monumental structures, all allegedly designed and built in just 2 years. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building alone was said to be the largest structure in the world at the time, covering 44 acres under a single roof. The official explanation is a marvel of efficiency. Teams of architects and craftsmen working around the clock, guided by the vision of a new age. But when you examine photographs of the finished buildings, you see something else. Stone facades so precise, domes so perfectly balanced, ornamentation so intricate that it seems almost impossible for such work to be temporary. And yet, just months later, nearly all of it was destroyed. This pattern repeats in city after city. The 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco rose less than a decade after the devastating earthquake and fire of 1906, when much of the city lay in ruins. We are told that in this short span, the city not only rebuilt itself but constructed a fairground filled with breathtaking architecture, colonnades stretching into the distance, towering pavilions, the Palace of Fine Arts with its massive rotunda reflected in a still lagoon. All of it, according to official history, made of temporary materials, meant to be dismantled when the fair was over. And so it was, except for the Palace of Fine Arts, which survived, but even it was stripped down and rebuilt in later years. Photographs of the construction process are scarce, far fewer than you would expect for such a massive undertaking in the age of industrial photography. For those who see Tartaria in these events, the explanation is simple. The buildings were not new at all. They were remnants, survivors of a civilization whose existence was being erased. The fairs were a convenient way to repurpose these structures, fill them with exhibitions, parade them before the public as triumphs of modern ingenuity, and then remove them before anyone could ask too many questions. It was not creation. It was controlled demolition, disguised as progress. And then there are the star forts, geometric star-shaped fortifications found in Europe, North America, Asia, and beyond. Officially, they were military designs meant to withstand cannon fire, the angular walls preventing blind spots for defenders. But when you map them out, you notice something peculiar. Many are placed in locations that make little strategic sense for defense, but perfect sense for something else: energy flow. Their proportions, angles, and orientation suggest a knowledge of geometry and resonance far beyond what was supposedly available at the time. Some theorists propose that these structures were not forts at all, but energy devices, built to harness or channel electromagnetic fields, perhaps even to power the massive buildings of Tartaria without burning a single lump of coal. Sound, too, enters the picture. Step into a grand cathedral or a government hall from the 19th century and speak aloud. Your voice doesn't just carry, it blooms, wrapping around the space with a clarity that feels almost alive. Acoustics like this don't happen by accident. Tartaria believers suggest these were not designed merely for sermons or speeches, but as resonance chambers, places where sound frequencies could be amplified and perhaps even used for technological purposes. Modern experiments with cymatics, the study of how sound affects matter, show that certain frequencies can shape patterns in sand, move small objects, even alter the properties of liquids. Imagine a civilization that had mastered this on a grand scale, using sound to lift heavy stones, to cut with precision, to transmit energy without wires. If such technology once existed, the implications are staggering. It would mean that the great industrial engines of the 19th century, steam, coal, oil, were not the only path forward. It would mean that clean, limitless energy might have been available centuries earlier, only to be buried alongside the buildings and maps of Tartaria. And if that knowledge threatened the economic order being built in the late 1800s, it is not hard to imagine why some might have wanted it erased. But the question lingers. If this technology and these structures were so advanced, why did they not survive? Why not adapt them? Use them? Pass them down? The darker answer is that they were not meant to survive. If the disappearance of Tartaria was indeed a deliberate act, then the destruction of its technology would have been essential to ensure that its people, or those who inherited their lands, could not rebuild it. What better way to secure a new world order than to erase the tools of the old one? The deeper you follow the trail, the less it feels like a random scattering of coincidences, and the more it feels like a story told backwards, with the ending written first and the middle chapters missing. Each grand building demolished after a world's fair, each star fort repurposed or left to crumble, each buried first floor revealed during city renovations. They begin to read like footnotes to a book that has been deliberately removed from the library. And yet, even with so much missing, the outline of the story is still there, faint but persistent, like the imprint of an erased word still visible under the page. If Tartaria was real, if its reach was as vast as the maps once claimed, if its technology was as advanced as the architecture suggests, if its people were as extraordinary as the myths remember, then its erasure was not just the loss of a civilization, but the loss of a different future for our own. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Not how Tartaria vanished, but what we might have become if it had not. There is a certain unease that settles in when you begin to imagine the deliberate rewriting of history. Not the gentle fading of memory over centuries, but a conscious, coordinated decision to erase an entire civilization from the record. It is one thing to lose something to time, to watch it crumble into dust. It is another to have it taken, hidden, and then replaced with a version of events designed to keep the truth locked away. The theory of Tartaria suggests exactly that, not just the erasure of a name from maps, but the removal of all supporting evidence, the reshaping of timelines, the rebranding of architecture, and the silencing of any oral traditions that might keep the memory alive. In this reading, the great disasters of the late 1800s and early 1900s begin to look less like coincidence and more like strategy. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, officially blamed on an overturned lantern in a barn, happened to wipe out the most ornate and substantial stone buildings in the city, while leaving many of the simpler wooden structures untouched. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 did not simply destroy, it targeted some of the grandest constructions in the city. Buildings that, to those who believe in the Tartarian link, bore the unmistakable hallmarks of that lost architectural tradition. Even global events, the First World War, the Spanish flu pandemic, can be seen through this lens as opportunities to dismantle and rebuild in ways that erased the physical traces of something older. Photographs from this period offer their own strange puzzle. We expect to see bustling streets in the heart of industrial-era cities, yet so many images show emptiness. Wide avenues without a carriage or cart in sight, vast plazas with no pedestrians, boulevards flanked by buildings but utterly devoid of movement. The standard explanation, of course, is the nature of early photography. Long exposure times that rendered moving objects invisible. But the sheer number of these eerily empty cityscapes makes some pause. Were these moments truly empty? Or were they captured during a transitional period, when certain areas had been cleared of their inhabitants, awaiting a new wave of settlers who would live in buildings that were not built for them? The emptiness becomes more disturbing when you pair it with the reports of human remains, not ordinary remains, but skeletons measuring 7, 8, even 9 feet in height. These were not isolated rumors. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers across America printed accounts of giant bones unearthed in fields, riverbanks, and burial mounds. Some were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian, others to local museums. And then, as if a curtain fell, the discoveries stopped being reported, and the specimens themselves seemed to vanish. Officially, they never existed. Unofficially, the question lingers. Were these the remains of Tartarians, quietly removed from public knowledge? This leads to another unsettling thought, that much of the architecture we now consider historical might be far older than we think, its construction misdated to fit the accepted narrative. Take, for example, the ornate stone facades and grand public halls built in the supposed age of steam and iron. Official history describes them as products of industrial skill, yet there is little photographic evidence of their construction. We have images of them complete, images of them in use, and sometimes images of their demolition, but almost nothing in between. It is as if they arrived fully formed, their origin story written only after they were in place. The mud flood theory fits neatly into this frame. If a sudden, massive event buried entire cities under mud and debris, then what we think of as the ground floor of many old buildings might actually be the second or third. This would explain the half-buried windows, the doorways that open into earth, and the underground levels that feel too grand to have been designed as basements. In cities like Seattle, these spaces are treated as curiosities for tourists. In others, they are sealed off, forgotten, or repurposed without explanation. The official story calls it the natural layering of streets over centuries. The alternative story sees it as the physical scar of a global catastrophe that erased not just buildings, but the civilization that built them. The more you think about it, the more the official explanations begin to sound like carefully placed stones in a wall, plausible enough to stand, but positioned to block any path toward an older truth. Urban development explains the buried architecture, but not why it appears across continents in the same narrow time frame. Photography limitations explain the empty streets, but not the sheer frequency of those images. Temporary construction explains the grand buildings of the world's fairs, but not the scarcity of construction records or the decision to demolish them almost immediately. Each answer covers a single detail, but when you step back, the whole picture feels unresolved. If Tartaria truly existed, then its removal from history was not just about territory or politics. It was about control over the story of human civilization, about deciding where our timeline begins, what we are capable of, and who we imagine ourselves to be. Acknowledging a civilization with advanced technology centuries ahead of its time, possibly inhabited by beings larger than ourselves, would demand a rewriting of everything from archaeology to anthropology. It would shift the foundation of education, industry, and even identity. And perhaps that is why, if the theory is correct, it had to be erased so thoroughly. But erasure is never perfect. Traces remain. They linger in the unreasonably large doorways of government buildings, in the identical architectural patterns found across continents, in the buried windows peering up from beneath the streets, in the rumors of bones that official history refuses to acknowledge. They hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to look long enough to notice that they don't quite fit the story we've been told. And so the question remains, suspended in the space between doubt and belief. Is Tartaria a myth woven from coincidences, or is it the echo of a truth too dangerous to remember? To find the answer, we have to follow the evidence, or the absences, wherever they lead, into the forgotten corners of cities, the faded ink of old maps, and the uncomfortable gaps in the stories we are certain we know. To walk through an old city with the eyes of someone who suspects a deeper history is to see a different landscape than the one in tourist brochures. Most people glance at a grand building and see nothing more than the craftsmanship of a bygone era. Perhaps a sense of civic pride carved into stone. But when you start to question the timelines, the methods, and the official stories, those same streets begin to feel like the surface of something else. A thin layer of the present stretched over the bones of a past that refuses to fully disappear. You notice the repetition first. The same ornate facades appearing in places thousands of miles apart. Government buildings in Washington, D.C., and St. Petersburg, Russia, bearing near-identical columns and domes. Train stations in Paris and Melbourne sharing the same proportions and archways. Even small-town courthouses in the American Midwest display architectural flourishes strikingly similar to those on distant continents. The official explanation leans on architectural fashion, the spread of neoclassicism and Beaux-Arts design through traveling architects and popular-style books. But that explanation wobbles when you consider the precision of the similarities. The patterns are too exact, the measurements too consistent, as though these buildings were the products of a shared blueprint rather than a shared aesthetic. And then there is the question of scale. Stand beneath the arch of a courthouse doorway that rises more than 20 feet, and the thought comes unbidden. Who exactly was this built for? Step inside and feel the ceiling floating so high above you that it seems to belong to another species' sense of proportion. Descend into what the modern city calls a basement, only to find windows looking out at walls of dirt. Windows that would have once faced the street, had the street not risen above them. All over the world, from Edinburgh to San Francisco to Istanbul, the same phenomenon repeats. Lower levels of buildings buried beneath the current ground, their original entrances now half submerged in history. The mudflood theory suggests these are not the result of slow urban development, but the aftermath of a singular catastrophic event in the 1800s, a surge of mud, silt, and debris that covered cities in a matter of days, perhaps even hours. Survivors would have had no choice but to build upward, sealing off the submerged floors and creating new entrances at the new street level. If this was a global event, it would explain the startling consistency of buried architecture across continents. It would also explain why these basements are often just as ornate, if not more so, than the levels above them, as though they were never meant to be underground in the first place. Skeptics argue that no such event could have happened without being recorded in countless diaries, newspapers, and government documents. But proponents counter that it was recorded in scattered reports of floods, landslides, earthquakes, and other disasters. Only those events have been reframed and compartmentalized so that no one sees the global pattern. Just as with the disappearance of Tartaria from maps, the record may have been deliberately fragmented, the story broken into pieces that look unconnected, unless you already suspect what to look for. Then there is the matter of technology. Some of the surviving structures attributed to the late 1800s display engineering feats that would challenge even modern builders. Massive stone blocks cut and placed with such precision that not a blade of grass could slip between them. Domes and vaulted ceilings that seemed to defy gravity, their weight distributed through perfect geometry. Intricate facades carved with such detail that they appear almost machine-made, yet without visible tool marks that match the methods supposedly available at the time. How, in an era when horse-drawn carts were still common in city streets, were these enormous pieces of stone moved, lifted, and set with such accuracy? One answer offered by Tartaria theorists is that these buildings were not constructed in the 19th century at all, but inherited from an earlier, more technologically advanced civilization. The same civilization, they argue, may have harnessed natural energy, electromagnetic fields, acoustic resonance, perhaps even wireless transmission of power, to accomplish what our current methods still find daunting. If true, this would explain not only the scale and precision of the architecture, but also the speed with which cities seemed to rebuild after disasters like fires and earthquakes. They weren't building from scratch. They were reclaiming and modifying what was already there. The implications of such an inheritance are enormous. If the cities of the 19th century were, in part, built upon the shells of an older civilization, then the industrial age was not a leap forward into progress, but a repurposing of someone else's achievements. And if that older civilization, call it Tartaria or something else, was capable of harnessing free energy, then the decision to erase it becomes easier to understand. Control over energy has always been control over power itself, both political and economic. A world that runs on decentralized, freely available energy does not need oil barons or coal tycoons, does not need massive centralized grids, and does not easily bend to the will of those who profit from scarcity. That, perhaps, is the heart of the Tartarian mystery. If the theory is true, then what was erased was not just a people or a culture, but an entire way of living. A way that might have been cleaner, more efficient, and more harmonious with the planet. A way that did not require strip mining the earth or covering landscapes with smokestacks. A way that, in the wrong hands, could still have been weaponized, but in the right hands might have changed the course of human history. Yet for all the grand implications, the trail always returns to small, tangible details. A photograph of a building half buried in earth, a map with a name that no longer exists, a half-forgotten newspaper clipping about bones that don't match modern human dimensions. It is these fragments that give the theory its persistence. Even if you dismiss the idea of giants, even if you doubt the possibility of free energy, even if you refuse to believe in a coordinated erasure of history, you are left with physical anomalies that the official story cannot fully explain. And it is in those anomalies, stubborn, visible, undeniable, that the shadow of Tartaria seems to linger. The more you look for Tartaria, the more you begin to realize that its ghost does not haunt only the grand monuments of old cities. It is in the quiet, unassuming places, too. The weathered brick building on a forgotten street, the strange pattern of stone embedded in the wall of a structure no one remembers being important, the massive archway hidden behind newer facades. You start to feel that the remnants of something older are everywhere, camouflaged under layers of paint, plaster, and modern signage. It's as if the city we know has been built like a costume over an older body, one that still breathes just beneath the surface. Walk long enough in the older districts of almost any major city, and you will find doors that now open into nothing, steps that lead straight into the ground, or streets where the windows of the first floor peer out from below your feet. Officially, these are just quirks of urban growth, the byproducts of street-level changes over time. But when you see the same phenomenon in city after city, in different countries, even on different continents, the explanation starts to feel too neat, too rehearsed. It is easier to accept when it's isolated, harder when the pattern repeats itself across the world in nearly identical form. The mud flood theory stretches even further here, suggesting that what we now call urban renewal in the 19th century was, in many cases, the uncovering and modification of older structures, the visible portions built upon, and the submerged portions either abandoned or repurposed. In some cases, these underground levels have become wine cellars, storage rooms, or even entire subterranean businesses, as in the Seattle Underground. In other cases, they've been filled in entirely, left as voids sealed off from public view. The idea that so many of these hidden spaces could exist without a larger, shared cause begins to gnaw at the edges of the accepted timeline. Even more curious is the consistency of the architectural details. The same kinds of arches, keystones, cornices, and relief carvings appear across cities that, according to official history, developed independently. A courthouse in the American South might have window moldings identical to a civic hall in Eastern Europe. A post office in Australia might feature the same geometric facade patterns as a train station in South America. The official narrative attributes this to architectural styles spreading through design books and international exhibitions. But there is a subtle difference between influence and duplication. Influence produces variation. Duplication suggests a shared origin. And then there is the question of how quickly these so-called new buildings appeared during the 19th century. The scale of the construction booms in certain cities is staggering. Vast neighborhoods, monumental public works, and massive civic buildings all erected in spans of time so short they would be challenging even with today's machinery. The labor force, the tools, the transport methods, the sheer logistics of materials, it all strains plausibility. Official history credits industrial advancements, but for some, the speed suggests that these were not wholly new constructions at all, but inherited structures being refurbished and reoccupied. In this light, the world's fairs take on an even stranger role. These expositions, celebrated as showcases of industrial progress, begin to look like elaborate stage sets for the unveiling and subsequent erasure of Tartarian remnants. If you had inherited an entire complex of advanced, beautiful buildings from a civilization no one was supposed to know about, how would you explain them? You might claim to have built them yourself, parade them in front of the world, and then tear them down as soon as the applause faded. By labeling them as temporary, you erase suspicion. By demolishing them, you erase evidence. The same logic applies to other public works of the period: massive railway stations, sprawling government complexes, monumental libraries. Many of these were allegedly constructed in record time, only to be replaced or heavily modified a few decades later. Why would a society pour resources into creating something so grand, only to dismantle or obscure it within a single generation. Unless, perhaps, their purpose had already been served, and their true origin was something that could not be left in open view. This leads back to the deeper question of why. Why remove Tartaria not only from the maps, but from the buildings, the photographs, the very memory of the people who might have inherited it? The answer most often given by those who believe in the theory is control. Control of history, of technology, of the narrative of human advancement. If the Tartarians had harnessed a form of free, wireless energy drawn from the Earth's natural fields or channeled through structures designed with geometric precision, then their existence poses a direct threat to the economic order that rose in the late 19th century. A civilization that needs no coal, no oil, no centralized power grid is a civilization that cannot be controlled by those who own those resources. And if the Tartarians were indeed physically larger than modern humans, if the scale of their architecture was made for beings of greater height and strength, then their existence challenges the very foundation of human history, as it is taught today. It would mean that our species is not the sole inheritor of the earth, that we live in a world once shaped by others whose abilities, tools, and knowledge far exceeded what we think possible for their time. It would suggest that much of what we call progress is not a linear climb, but a recovery, and not even a full one at that. For now, the story of Tartaria remains officially unwritten, its name absent from the maps, its traces scattered in stone and brick and buried streets. But the absence itself is a kind of presence, a quiet resistance to the narrative we are told to accept. Every time someone notices a half-buried window or a doorway too tall for its current inhabitants, the ghost stirs again. And perhaps that is why the theory persists. Not because it has been proven beyond doubt, but because the world we can see with our own eyes does not always match the world we are told exists. If there is one thread that makes the Tartarian theory feel less like legend and more like an unsolved puzzle, it is the question of their supposed technology. Not the kind of technology that fills museums with gears and levers, but something far stranger, a way of working with nature itself. The theory insists that their architecture was not only a statement of power or artistry, but a functioning part of an energy system we no longer understand. Look closely at the great domes, spires, and towers of certain old buildings, and you might notice something unusual. They often sit at points of geometric precision, their shapes repeating with uncanny accuracy across continents. Many of these features, tall metal spires, finials, intricate lattice work, are dismissed today as decorative. But believers argue they were functional, designed to collect and transmit energy. The idea is that Tartarian structures could draw power from the Earth's natural electromagnetic fields or from atmospheric electricity, channeling it through architectural forms tuned to specific frequencies. This is where the theory meets the more mysterious side of science. We know that certain shapes, domes, cones, pyramids, can focus or direct energy, just as certain materials conduct it more efficiently. We know that sound waves can shape matter, that frequencies can resonate in ways that amplify their effects. Experiments in the modern era, from Nikola Tesla's wireless power demonstrations to more recent studies in cymatics, hint at a physics that is still only partly understood. For Tartaria believers, these are not new discoveries. but rediscoveries, echoes of a knowledge that once allowed an entire civilization to thrive without burning coal or damming rivers. The suggestion is almost heretical in the context of accepted history. If the Tartarians truly had such technology, then the Industrial Revolution, celebrated as the dawn of modern progress, may have been, in some ways, a step backward. Instead of moving toward cleaner, limitless energy, humanity might have turned away from it, burying the knowledge under layers of smoke, steel, and centralized control. And if you were someone in the late 1800s looking to build an empire on oil or coal, the last thing you would want is for people to know that they could power their homes, factories, and even transport systems for free, simply by tapping into the planet's own natural forces. Even more provocative are the claims about sound. Many grand Tartarian-style buildings possess acoustics so perfect that a whisper in one corner can be heard clearly across a vast hall. This is not just the result of good architecture for speeches or music. Some believe these spaces were designed as resonance chambers, capable of focusing and amplifying sound waves to such a degree that they could be used for practical work. Moving objects, cutting materials, even aiding in construction. Theories suggest that by matching the right frequencies to certain materials, the Tartarians could manipulate matter on a scale that seems impossible without heavy machinery. This would also explain the speed with which massive structures were built in the late 1800s and early 1900s. If these were in fact restorations or modifications of older Tartarian buildings, and if the technology to move and shape materials was built into the structures themselves, then the official timelines suddenly become more plausible, though for reasons very different from what the history books suggest. It's a vision of the past that feels almost like science fiction, and yet it is anchored in physical reality. The buildings exist, the acoustic phenomena can be measured, the geometric precision can be documented. What is missing is the acknowledgement, the willingness to connect the dots in a way that challenges the accepted story. Skeptics, of course, push back hard. They argue that the supposed energy devices were simply stylistic choices, that the acoustics are the result of trial and error by skilled builders, that any resemblance between buildings on different continents is the natural outcome of global architectural trends, and yet the skepticism rarely addresses the larger pattern, the speed, the scale, the mysterious disappearances of both artifacts and records. It is as if the debate is designed to stay confined to individual details, never to step back far enough to see the whole picture. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of the theory is that it invites you to look at the world differently. You begin to walk through cities with a new kind of attention. You notice the strange metal ornaments crowning old buildings, the way some towers seem aligned with others miles away, the deliberate symmetry in facades that no one bothers to replicate today. You wonder why, in an age that supposedly revered progress, so many of these grand structures were demolished or allowed to decay within a generation of their supposed construction. And you begin to suspect that the story of human advancement is less like a straight road and more like a winding path, one with detours, loops, and perhaps deliberate roadblocks. If Tartaria's technology really did exist, then somewhere, somehow, pieces of it might still be out there. Not just in the stone and metal of old buildings, but in forgotten blueprints, in journals buried in archives, in the oral histories of communities whose stories have never been written down. The question is not only whether we can find these fragments, but whether we would recognize them if we did. Would we see them as relics of a lost civilization, or simply as curiosities from a past we think we already understand? For now, the buildings remain silent, their spires pointing skyward like unanswered questions, their domes holding the echo of voices long gone. And in that silence, the possibility lingers that what we call history is only one version of events, and that somewhere beneath it lies another, waiting for those willing to dig deeper. If the heart of the Tartarian mystery lies in its technology, then its disappearance may lie in something far more human, the deliberate act of removal. It is one thing for a civilization to fall through war, disease, or natural disaster. It is another for its memory to be wiped clean, its artifacts dismantled, its name struck from the maps as if it had never existed. The theory's most unsettling claim is that this erasure was not the result of a single calamity, but of a coordinated, decades-long campaign. What some now call the Great Reset, not in the modern sense of economic planning, but as a historical purge. The late 1800s and early 1900s were decades of upheaval. In the space of a few generations, the world saw the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, the First World War, the Spanish flu pandemic, and then the Second World War. Each was catastrophic in its own way, reshaping cities, economies, and populations. Officially, they were unrelated, accidents of history, outbreaks of violence, inevitable cycles of disease. But within the Tartarian narrative, these events take on a different hue. Each becomes an opportunity, not only to rebuild, but to replace. Not just to remove old buildings, but to remove the very people and stories tied to them. The Great Chicago Fire, for example, destroyed some of the city's most ornate structures, yet left many simpler wooden buildings untouched. The official cause, a cow kicking over a lantern, has always felt almost insultingly small for the scale of the destruction. The San Francisco earthquake flattened districts filled with grand stone and brick buildings, the kind that Tartaria believers point to as evidence of an older architecture. The First World War devastated large swaths of Europe, turning cities into rubble, and in the process, erasing countless examples of pre-industrial monumental architecture. Even the Spanish flu, which killed tens of millions worldwide, is seen through this lens as a depopulation event, one that could have swept away communities tied to the remnants of the old order. Photographs from this period seem to hint at a quieter truth. In the aftermath of these disasters, the rebuilding was often shockingly fast, sometimes suspiciously so. Entire districts would reappear within a few years, supposedly from scratch, yet built to scales and styles far beyond what the post-disaster workforce and resources should have allowed. This has led some to suggest that these were not truly new constructions at all, but restored or repurposed structures that had survived beneath the rubble, stripped of any markings or symbols that might betray their true origin. It is in these gaps, between destruction and rebuilding, that the theory finds its most haunting imagery. Empty streets in photographs, not just for moments, but as if whole areas had been cleared of life. Rows of immaculate buildings without a single person visible, wide boulevards with no traffic, no carts, no carriages. The standard explanation of long photographic exposures accounts for some of this, but not all. Even with a slow shutter, People standing still should appear, at least faintly. Yet in many of these images there is nothing, not even a blur. It is as if the streets were truly deserted, caught in a moment when life had not yet returned, or perhaps had been deliberately kept away. The emptiness feeds into darker speculations. If there was indeed a campaign to erase Tartaria, then it might have involved more than buildings. It might have involved the removal or displacement of entire populations, ensuring that those who remembered the truth could not pass it on. In this light, disasters and wars become tools, brutal, efficient, and cloaked in plausible deniability. The devastation is public, but the motive remains hidden. This idea stretches beyond cities and into the countryside, where reports of giant skeletons found in the late 19th and early 20th centuries emerge like strange fragments of an alternate history. Newspapers of the time reported discoveries of human remains far larger than normal. Skeletons 7, 8, even 9 feet tall, often found in burial mounds or during construction projects. Many were allegedly sent to the Smithsonian or similar institutions, only to vanish without record. Mainstream historians dismiss these as hoaxes or exaggerations, but if the Tartarians were indeed a race of larger humans, these finds could be their last physical evidence. Evidence that would need to be removed if the new narrative of history were to take hold. And so, in the theory's telling, the Great Reset was as much about memory as it was about material. Every war, every fire, every epidemic became a page torn from the book. By the time the new century had truly begun, the pages that remained told a different story, one in which Tartaria had never existed, in which the grand buildings of the past were the product of a recent and triumphant industrial age, in which humanity had climbed steadily upward from primitive beginnings to modern mastery. To question that story is to question the entire foundation of how we understand ourselves. It is not just about architecture or maps. It is about the timeline of civilization itself. If the theory is correct, then modern humanity did not build upon the ruins of a less advanced past, but upon the remnants of a civilization far beyond our current capabilities. And that changes everything: our place in history, our trajectory for the future, even the legitimacy of the systems that govern us. For now, the Great Reset remains a theory, unproven yet persistent, fueled by the anomalies that refuse to be explained away: the empty photographs, the buried buildings, the vanished bones, the uncanny similarities in architecture across continents. They are pieces of a puzzle that no one in authority seems eager to solve. And perhaps that is the most telling detail of all, because history, like any story, is as much about what is left out as what is included. And somewhere in those omissions, Tartaria waits. If there is one place where the memory of Tartaria might still linger openly, it is in the oldest stories we tell, the myths, legends, and folklore passed down through generations. These tales, born long before printed maps and formal histories, carry echoes of something older than the civilizations we know. They speak of giants, of cities that shone like the sun, of technologies and wonders that have no place in the timelines we are taught. And the strangest part is that these stories are not confined to one culture or one corner of the world. They appear everywhere, scattered across continents, carried by peoples who supposedly had no contact with one another. In the Bible, the Nephilim are described as beings of extraordinary size and power, the offspring of divine beings and humans living in a time before the Great Flood. In Greek mythology, there are the Titans, ancient rulers overthrown by the Olympian gods. Norse legends tell of the Jötnar, formidable giants who existed before the shaping of the current world. Native American tribes speak of enormous warriors who once walked the land, some friendly, others fierce and territorial. The Polynesian islands have stories of long-limbed builders who could carry massive stones for temple construction. Even in Asia, from the Himalayan myths of towering snow giants to the Chinese tales of colossal ancestors, the theme repeats. There were once people far larger than we are today, and they shaped the world in ways we can no longer match. Mainstream scholars tend to explain these parallels as archetypes, symbols of human fears, aspirations, and the need to personify natural forces. Giants in this reading are metaphors for challenges too great for ordinary people, or the embodiment of an age when life itself was larger in scale. But those who study the Tartarian theory see something different, not allegory, but memory. They suggest that these myths are the fragmented recollections of real encounters, passed down through oral tradition long after the civilizations that birthed them were gone. Over time, the details blurred, the names changed, but the core of the story remained. There were giants once, and they built marvels. When you consider this possibility, certain features of Tartarian architecture begin to make more sense. The vast doorways and towering ceilings might not have been designed to impress smaller humans, but to serve as practical spaces for inhabitants of greater stature. Staircases with unusually deep treads, furniture too large to be comfortable for average-sized people, and the general scale of public buildings from the 19th century all take on a different meaning. They are no longer monuments to excess, but signs of a world built to different proportions. The reports of giant skeletons discovered in the 19th and early 20th centuries gain new weight in this light. If even a fraction of these finds were genuine, they would stand as physical confirmation of what so many cultures have remembered in their myths. Yet, in the official record, they are conspicuously absent. Skeptics insist that most were hoaxes, products of sensationalist journalism in an era when strange discoveries could sell newspapers. But the sheer number of reports and their distribution across the globe makes dismissal harder for those inclined to see patterns. If these remains were real, their removal from public view would be essential to protecting the narrative that humanity has always been as it is now. There is also the matter of scale in construction, not just in public buildings, but in infrastructure. Bridges, aqueducts, and even certain old roadways seem overbuilt for the traffic they were meant to carry in the 19th century. Some theorists speculate that these were not designed for horse-drawn carts or early automobiles, but for vehicles and loads far heavier, perhaps moved by methods we no longer possess. The consistency of this overbuilding across different countries hints at a shared origin, as though many nations inherited fragments of the same blueprint without knowing its full purpose. If Tartaria was a civilization of giants, then its erasure becomes even more comprehensible. The existence of such beings would force a complete re-evaluation of human evolution, anthropology, and even the boundaries of what it means to be human. It would suggest that our world was once home to not just one intelligent species, but at least two. and that the one we replaced may have been physically and technologically superior. That is not an easy truth for any culture to absorb, much less for the power structures of the modern world, which rest on the idea of a steady, unbroken progression from primitive to advanced under our own control. Yet, for all the potential upheaval such a revelation might cause, the traces remain stubbornly embedded in our cultural DNA. The stories of giants have persisted not because they are convenient or comforting. Most portray these beings as dangerous or alien, but because they have roots too deep to be pulled out entirely. They have survived fires, wars, and the slow erosion of time. And now, in an age when digital archives and image sharing can preserve anomalies that might once have been quietly destroyed, the legend of Tartaria finds new life. It is possible, of course, that all of this is coincidence, that the myths are symbolic, the architecture is stylistic, and the scattered reports of giant bones are simply fabrications. But when you stand in front of a doorway twice your height, in a building said to have been built for people just like you, and you realize how small you feel inside it, the idea that it was made for someone else does not seem quite so far-fetched. In the end, the question of Tartaria's giants may not hinge on finding a single, undeniable piece of evidence. It may hinge instead on the accumulation of details, the way the puzzle comes together when you allow yourself to see that the pieces do not fit the official picture. And once you see that, it becomes harder to stop looking, because if the giants were real, then Tartaria was real. And if Tartaria was real, then history, as we have been taught, is incomplete. The hardest part to imagine is not the existence of Tartaria itself, but the disappearance, not the fall of a single city, or the collapse of an empire in war, but the dismantling of an entire world so completely that it slipped almost entirely out of memory. We are accustomed to ruins. Rome left its stones, Egypt left its pyramids. Even civilizations that vanished long before written history still speak through crumbling walls, scattered pottery, and carvings in rock. But in the case of Tartaria, if the theory is true, the ruins are not in the desert or deep in the jungle. They are beneath our feet, hiding in plain sight, rebranded as something else. Erasure on this scale requires more than destruction. It requires replacement. You cannot simply tear down a civilization of such size and complexity without leaving gaps. Those gaps must be filled with new buildings, new maps, new stories. And so the 19th and early 20th centuries become a blur of new construction, urban redevelopment, and industrial progress, all moving at a pace that strains belief. Cities across the world were said to be transformed in mere decades, their skylines filled with monumental architecture, their infrastructure rebuilt to match a modern age. Yet when you look closely at photographs, the transformation seems less like new growth and more like repurposing. Structures that do not fit the supposed era of their creation suddenly appear fully formed, without the photographic evidence of their construction that you might expect in an age already obsessed with documenting progress. The psychological part of erasure is just as important. Once the physical traces are hidden or destroyed, the next step is to rewrite the narrative, to create an official story so complete and so widely accepted that no one thinks to question it. This is where education, literature, and even popular culture play their roles. In the case of Tartaria, The term itself was gradually redefined in dictionaries and encyclopedias, shrinking from a vast empire spanning continents to a vague geographic label for nomadic tribes. By the early 20th century, it was no longer a political entity at all, just a historical footnote, its maps filed away as curiosities from a less accurate age. The replacement of memory also works on a more personal scale. As generations pass, the people who might have remembered the truth, or at least fragments of it, grow old. Their children are taught new names for old streets, new histories for old buildings. In time, even the questions fade. A grand hall with doors far taller than necessary becomes simply ornate architecture. A buried floor becomes a basement. The strange alignment of buildings along invisible lines becomes coincidence. And with each redefinition, the older meaning drifts further out of reach. For those who believe in the theory, the Great Reset was not just about removing Tartaria from the physical world, but from the human mind. Wars and disasters were the visible part of the process, the loud moments that cleared the way for reconstruction. But the quieter work, the changing of maps, the editing of history books, the control of archives, was what ensured that future generations would inherit only the story chosen for them. The difficulty now is that so much time has passed. The witnesses are gone, and the physical evidence where it remains is scattered and often disguised. A single building, no matter how strange its proportions, can be dismissed as an anomaly. A photograph of an empty street can be explained by the quirks of old cameras. Even a dozen examples, spread across the globe, can be written off as coincidence if you are determined not to connect them. And yet, for those willing to look, the pattern emerges. A shadow timeline running parallel to the official one, visible only in the anomalies. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that we could be living in the aftermath of such an erasure without knowing it. If Tartaria was real, then the streets we walk every day, the buildings we pass without a second glance, may be remnants of a world that was never meant to vanish. The thought changes the way you see the familiar. You begin to notice the strange proportions of old structures, the way certain districts feel older than their recorded history, the subtle differences in stonework between what was built in the same year. The city becomes a palimpsest, a page that has been scraped clean and written over, yet still bears faint traces of the original words. And perhaps the most haunting part is this. If Tartaria could be erased so thoroughly that it exists now only in scattered clues and half-remembered stories, then what else might have been lost in the same way? How many other civilizations, technologies, or histories have been overwritten, their absence so well disguised that we do not even know to miss them? The theory of Tartaria forces you to consider the possibility that our collective memory is not as complete as we believe, that what we call history may be only one version of a much larger, more complicated truth. In the end, the disappearance of Tartaria is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about how easily our perception of reality can be shaped, and how fragile the truth can be when it is left in the hands of those who benefit from controlling it. And once you begin to see the gaps, the temptation to fill them becomes irresistible. To search for Tartaria in the modern world is not to comb through distant ruins or venture into uncharted wilderness. It is to walk through the familiar with eyes that see differently. The hunt begins not with maps or ancient scrolls, but with the streets under our own feet. places that people pass every day without realizing they might be stepping over the remains of something far older than the official story allows. The clues are not hidden in vaults. They are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to stop, look, and wonder. You start in a city center, somewhere with an old town district preserved for its charm. At first, it is all postcard scenes, cobblestone streets, decorative facades, ornate ironwork. But the longer you linger, the more the details press forward. A row of windows, half buried at street level, their sills lined with dirt. A door that opens directly into a wall of earth, with no staircase or corridor behind it. A set of steps leading down into what looks like a basement, yet the floor there is paved and finished like the ground floor of any other building. These are small things, easy to dismiss, until you realize they repeat, block after block, city after city. In places like Seattle, this peculiarity has been turned into an attraction, the underground tour, where visitors walk through what was once the street level of the city before it was raised in the late 19th century. The official story speaks of practical engineering solutions to flooding and waste disposal. But when you see similar buried levels in places that never had those same problems, in Paris, in Istanbul, in Buenos Aires, the explanation starts to strain. The consistency suggests something larger, something global, that left parts of cities submerged under layers of soil and debris. Some structures tell their story through scale alone. In older parts of St. Petersburg, doorways tower far above human height, their arches so high that even the tallest person would seem small beneath them. In Vienna, grand staircases stretch so wide and shallow that each step feels designed for a stride longer than your own. In certain railway stations built in the 19th century, the ceilings soar so high above the tracks that they seem almost absurd for their stated function, unless you imagine them serving beings of greater size or housing technology that required such vast open spaces. Then there is the stonework. In cities across Europe and the Americas, you can find buildings whose masonry looks far older than their recorded construction date. Enormous blocks, cut with perfect precision, fitted so tightly together that the seams are barely visible. The wear and weathering on these stones often seems out of proportion to their supposed age, as though they had stood for centuries before being incorporated into more modern structures. Walk around certain districts, and you will notice that some walls have a lower section made of massive, ancient-looking stone with upper levels built from much newer materials, as if the foundation belonged to one era and the rest was added later. Photographs from the late 1800s sometimes reveal these oddities in sharper relief. Images of construction projects show workers not building something from the ground up, but excavating, clearing soil away from already existing walls. In some cases, the new building looks suspiciously like a renovation of something much older, its fresh facade masking a deeper history. This is where the official narrative tends to grow vague, offering few details about what was there before or why the site was chosen. Even more intriguing are the patterns of alignment. Some old buildings, especially those with domes or spires, seem to be placed along invisible lines, grids that stretch across cities or even continents. These alignments often correspond to astronomical points, magnetic anomalies, or ancient sacred sites. Mainstream historians call this coincidence, or a side effect of city planning traditions. But to those who believe in Tartaria, it suggests a network, a deliberate system for channeling energy, communication, or something else we no longer understand. It is one thing to read about these patterns. It is another to stand in the middle of them. Imagine standing in a plaza in Lisbon, feeling the open space around you, then realizing that the spire of a distant cathedral lines up perfectly with a monument miles away, and both align with the sunset on a specific day of the year. Or walking through the streets of Prague and noticing that certain domes seem to echo each other's shapes, each topped with metallic structures that catch the light in the same way. Once you see it, it is difficult to believe it is random. For believers, these alignments and architectural consistencies are not just the remnants of a style. They are the last visible signs of a system that once spanned continents. A system of construction that was not bound by the limitations we assume existed in the 18th and 19th centuries. A system that may have been inherited from Tartaria and then dismantled piece by piece, replaced with structures that imitated its look but not its function. Of course, not everyone who notices these things jumps to the same conclusion. Some accept that there are mysteries in urban history, but stop short of believing in a lost empire. Others see the patterns as tantalizing coincidences, the product of shared human creativity rather than a single forgotten civilization. And yet, the anomalies persist. Too numerous, too consistent, too strange to be ignored. If you begin looking for Tartaria, you might start with a single detail: a buried window, a doorway too tall, a foundation of ancient stone under a modern building. But the search rarely ends there. Each anomaly leads to another. Each unanswered question hints at a larger picture. And soon, you find yourself seeing the city not as it is, but as it might have been. Layers of time stacked on top of one another, with the deepest layer belonging to something the history books do not name. Maps are the memory of the world. They record not only where things are, but what we believe exists. For centuries, the maps of European powers showed the presence of a massive land called Grand Tartary, a name written boldly across the heart of Eurasia, spanning an expanse so vast it dwarfed many known empires. French, Dutch, German, and English cartographers all placed it in the same region, its borders stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, from the Arctic edge down into Central Asia. This was not the uncertain, dotted outline of a rumor or a myth. These were confident strokes, the kind that marked established territories. And yet, in the 19th century, the name vanishes, not gradually, not in the slow fade of political decline, but suddenly, as if the entire land had been lifted from the earth and erased. The disappearance from maps mirrors the disappearance from historical records. Older encyclopedias describe Tartary in detail, sometimes noting its subdivisions: Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary. By the early 20th century, the same volumes reduce it to a vague, outdated geographic term, or omit it entirely. This shift is more than an academic update. It is the rewriting of a landscape, replacing one story with another until the old one is no longer remembered at all. For those who follow the Tartarian theory, the maps are not just curious artifacts. They are evidence of an intentional erasure. If Tartaria had simply been a misinterpretation of the geography, why did so many nations agree on its location for centuries? And why did its removal happen so abruptly across so many sources at the same time? The speed and coordination suggest a decision, not an accident, a deliberate redrawing of the world. Photographs from the same era reveal a similar strangeness. The earliest images of major cities in the late 1800s often show them eerily empty. Streets stretch away without a single pedestrian. Plazas stand silent, devoid of the bustle you would expect, even in a less crowded age. The standard explanation is a technical one. Early cameras required long exposure times, so moving people would not appear in the final image. But this does not explain why, in so many photographs, there are no stationary figures at all, no one leaning against a wall, sitting on a bench, or standing still enough to register. Some images go further. They show grand buildings surrounded by open space, as though the city has not yet grown around them. In others, monumental structures stand alone, with little sign of the construction or infrastructure that would have been necessary to build them. It is as if these buildings appeared before the rest of the city, awaiting the smaller, newer structures that would eventually crowd in around them. Then there are the photographs that seem to hint at excavation rather than construction. Workers stand in deep pits, clearing soil away from ornate stone walls. In some cases, the level they are uncovering is more elaborate than the one above it. Carved arches, decorative windows, columns. Official captions describe these scenes as foundations being laid or basements being dug, but the visual evidence suggests the opposite, that something older is being revealed, cleaned, and then built upon. The lack of construction photographs for some of the most important 19th century buildings is another curiosity. We have extensive records of events, parades, and daily life from the period, yet for certain monumental structures, there are few or no images of the building process. The pattern repeats at World's Fairs, where vast complexes of supposedly temporary buildings appear, fully finished, with little photographic documentation of the work that brought them into existence. The fairs are celebrated, the buildings are photographed in their glory, and then they are demolished, their absence explained away as the dismantling of temporary structures, despite their apparent permanence. For believers, the cartographic and photographic record forms a kind of double evidence. The maps tell us that Tartaria was recognized, acknowledged, and placed in the physical world for centuries. The photographs, decades later, show us cities filled with buildings whose origins do not fit their assigned timelines, standing in empty streets or half buried beneath the modern ground level. Together, they suggest a gap in the narrative, a missing chapter between the disappearance of the name and the rise of the cities we know today. Skeptics counter that maps change all the time as borders shift, that photography in its early days was more art than documentation, and that coincidences of style and scale can be explained by the global exchange of ideas. But even if each anomaly has a plausible explanation on its own, the accumulation of them across so many places and sources is harder to dismiss. The maps and photos begin to look less like isolated oddities and more like glimpses of a story told in reverse, its beginning hidden, its end already written. Standing in front of an old map with Grand Tartary inked across it, or studying a century-old photograph of an empty street lined with towering stone facades, you can feel the pull of that missing story. It is not just curiosity. It is a sense of incompleteness, as though the world you thought you knew is missing a layer, And once you sense that absence, you begin to see it everywhere, not only in archives and museums, but in the streets you walk every day. If there is a single event that ties together the empty streets in old photographs, the buried windows in modern cities, and the sudden disappearance of Tartaria from maps, it is the so-called mud flood. The theory describes it not as a local disaster, but as a global reset, a wave of earth, silt, and debris that buried large portions of cities across continents in the 19th century. It does not have the neat boundaries of a volcanic eruption or the epicenter of an earthquake. Instead, it seems to have happened everywhere and nowhere all at once, leaving behind a pattern of half-submerged architecture and streets built on top of older streets. The official explanations for these buried structures are practical: urban development, changes in street level over time, flooding in certain districts, or deliberate elevation to improve sanitation. In isolation, any one of these makes sense. But when you see the same phenomenon repeated in cities with entirely different geographies, from the flat plains of the American Midwest to the ancient hills of Eastern Europe, the argument for coincidence begins to feel thin. The photographs from the late 1800s show it clearly. Workers standing in front of ornate stone facades with their first floors completely below the modern street. The windows half covered in dirt, as though the ground itself had swallowed them. What makes the mud flood idea so provocative is that it offers a physical mechanism for erasing a civilization without completely destroying its infrastructure. If Tartaria's buildings and cities were caught in such an event, they could have been buried quickly and efficiently. In the aftermath, the survivors, whether part of that civilization or the ones who inherited their lands, would have had two choices: dig them out and reclaim them, or build on top of what was left. The result is exactly what we see today: grand architecture sitting on foundations that no longer match the ground level, strange underground spaces treated as basements when they were clearly once the main floor, and streets that seem unnaturally elevated compared to the buildings they pass. In some places, the evidence is strikingly direct. Seattle's underground tour allows visitors to walk along what was once the city's main streets, now entombed beneath the current level. In New York, subway construction has uncovered stonework far older and more refined than the city's official timeline suggests. Across Eastern Europe, there are buildings where the main entrance is now several feet below street level, accessible only by descending stairs into what feels like the shadow of the modern city. Even in small towns, you can find shop fronts with windows set into the ground, their frames filled with dirt, their purpose forgotten. Believers in the mud flood theory suggest that this event may not have been a slow accumulation of earth, but a sudden, catastrophic shift, perhaps triggered by a natural disaster on a scale we cannot easily imagine. Some speak of global liquefaction, where the soil itself turned to a fluid state and engulfed the lower portions of buildings. Others speculate about massive floods caused by the melting of ice or the collapse of ancient dams, the kind that would sweep across continents rather than single valleys. More radical theories imagine it as the result of advanced technology gone wrong, an energy experiment or atmospheric manipulation by Tartaria itself, or by those who sought to end it. The most compelling part of the theory, for those who believe it, is how neatly it explains the gap in history. A sudden, widespread event would not only bury physical evidence, It would disrupt populations, erase records, and create the perfect opportunity for new powers to take control of the narrative. In the years following the supposed mud flood, the maps change, the buildings are repurposed or demolished, and the name Tartaria disappears from common use. What remains is absorbed into the story of the industrial age, rebranded as the triumph of modern engineering over a simpler pre-modern past. Skeptics counter that there is no written record of a disaster on such a scale, and that geology does not support a global event in the 1800s. They point to the normal processes of city growth, the raising of street levels to combat flooding, and the tendency of builders to reuse older foundations. But believers respond that the lack of documentation is itself suspicious, that if such an event were tied to the end of Tartaria, the very people who benefited from its disappearance would have been the ones in control of the archives, deciding what would and would not be remembered. In this reading, the mud flood becomes not just a disaster, but the final chapter in a deliberate erasure. Whether it was natural or engineered, it served the same purpose. It hid the architecture, disrupted the population, and left the stage clear for a complete rewriting of history. And once the rebuilding began, the past could be redefined however the new powers wished. To walk through a city with this in mind is to see it differently. A row of half-buried windows becomes a relic of a time before the ground rose to meet them. A staircase leading down into a dim, stone-walled room feels less like a basement and more like an entrance to a lost street. Even the uneven patterns of urban layout, where certain roads suddenly dip or rise without clear reason, take on a new meaning, as if the city is draped over an older, hidden form. The mud flood, if it happened, was not simply a geological event. It was the hinge on which two worlds turned. One, the older and more advanced civilization whose name was erased, and the other, the modern age built upon its bones. Whether it was an accident of nature or the result of human intent, it remains the part of the theory that is most tangible, most visible to anyone willing to look down at the ground they walk on and imagine what might be buried beneath. If the mud flood was the moment that buried Tartaria's cities, then what followed may have been just as important, the deliberate reshaping of what was left. A catastrophe alone cannot erase a civilization. The ruins themselves will still speak if they are left untouched. But if those ruins can be claimed, altered, or disguised, the story they tell can be changed completely. The decades after the supposed mud flood read, to those who believe the theory, like the second act of a carefully orchestrated operation. The cover-up. In the official history, the late 19th and early 20th centuries were an era of rebuilding and rapid urban growth. Cities expanded their boundaries, constructed new infrastructure, and filled their skylines with monumental architecture. To most, it was the Industrial Revolution made visible in stone and steel. But to those who see Tartaria in the shadows, much of this rebuilding was less about new creation and more about rebranding the remnants of what had survived beneath the mud. Consider the pattern. After a disaster, whether fire, earthquake, or flood, certain districts are cleared, supposedly to make way for modern construction. The rebuilding is described in glowing terms, with architects and planners praised for their speed and ingenuity. Yet when you examine photographs from the time, the process often looks suspiciously like excavation rather than construction. Workers are seen removing layers of soil from elaborate stone facades, revealing lower levels that appear older, weathered, and more ornate than the upper portions. In many cases, those lower levels are bricked over or sealed, leaving only the new upper stories visible. When new buildings were truly erected, their designs often imitated the grandeur of the older ones, the domes, the arches, the decorative stonework, but without the same depth of craftsmanship. These copies could stand beside the originals without drawing too much attention, blending the inherited and the fabricated into a single urban fabric. Over time, as the older structures were demolished or altered, the surviving copies became the authentic style of the era, and the true origins of the form were forgotten. The world's fairs fit neatly into this narrative. These vast exhibitions, celebrated as triumphs of industrial age creativity, may have served as the perfect stage for showcasing Tartarian architecture under a new identity. Entire complexes of grand buildings were said to be constructed in record time, often using temporary materials like plaster over wooden frames. Yet in photographs, they appear solid, permanent, and built to last. The fairs would run their course, the crowds would marvel, and then the buildings would be torn down. The official reason was that temporary structures could not be maintained, but in the eyes of Tartaria theorists, the real reason was that the buildings were not temporary at all. They were relics of the old world, briefly revealed, then destroyed to prevent anyone from asking where they truly came from. This process wasn't limited to monumental public works. Smaller buildings, too, were altered to fit the new narrative. Entrances were moved to the second story, leaving the original ground floor buried and inaccessible. Facades were stripped and refaced, erasing carvings or inscriptions that might hint at a different origin. Entire neighborhoods were modernized, their streets raised, their older structures demolished, and replaced with more conventional designs. In some cases, even the street layouts themselves were altered, breaking up alignments that may once have served a larger purpose. Archives and records followed a similar pattern. Old maps that showed Tartaria were quietly retired, replaced with new ones that omitted the name entirely. Architectural drawings, construction photographs, and documents relating to the rebuilding of certain cities are either sparse or missing altogether. Where records do exist, they often begin abruptly, as though the history of the place before a certain date had simply ceased to matter. The result is a kind of historical amnesia, not a blank page, but a page rewritten so convincingly that few think to question it. This deliberate blending of the old and the new may be why Tartaria, if it existed, has been so hard to prove. Its remains are not in a single location to be excavated and displayed. They are woven into the cities we live in, altered just enough to pass as something else. The walls may still stand, the foundations may still hold, but their story has been overwritten by a century and a half of careful editing. And yet for those who know where to look, the clues remain. A mismatched foundation stone in an otherwise uniform building, an entrance that seems too large for its doors, a staircase that once led somewhere it no longer can. These are the quiet fractures in the official story, the places where the past pushes through despite the best efforts to contain it. If the cover-up was as thorough as the theory claims, then it was not the work of a single government or institution. It would have required cooperation, or at least parallel action, across multiple nations, all moving towards the same goal: to erase the evidence of a civilization that would upend the accepted history of human development. Whether that cooperation was intentional or simply the result of shared interests in maintaining control, the outcome was the same. By the mid-20th century, Tartaria had vanished not only from the maps, but from the minds of nearly everyone, existing only in scattered hints and half-forgotten whispers. And that may be the most remarkable part of the story. Not that such a civilization could be erased, but that the erasure could be so complete. It is one thing to hide stones beneath the earth. It is another to bury them beneath a narrative so convincing that even those standing on top of them never realize what lies below. If Tartaria truly existed, if its buildings, technology, and perhaps even its people once stood across half the world, then the question that rises above all others is simple. Why erase it? What could be so threatening about a lost civilization that it would need to be removed not only from history books, but from memory itself? The answer, for those who believe the theory, lies not in the past, but in the world that replaced it. The first and most obvious reason is control. Power, in any era, is built on the ability to shape the story of who we are and how we came to be. If Tartaria possessed technology centuries ahead of its time, technology that could provide limitless, clean energy by harnessing natural forces, then its survival in our collective memory would undermine the systems that rose to dominate the modern age. In a world where energy is free and decentralized, there is no oil empire, no coal monopoly, no sprawling electrical grid owned by a handful of companies. Such a world is far harder to control because control depends on scarcity. Remove scarcity, and you remove the leverage that allows governments and corporations to bend populations to their will. There is also the matter of technology's potential for disruption. If Tartaria had mastered wireless power transmission, resonant sound manipulation, or architectural designs that could channel and store energy, then rediscovering even fragments of that knowledge could overturn entire industries overnight. It could render obsolete the technologies that have shaped the last 2 centuries of human life. And if such discoveries fell into the hands of people unwilling to share them freely, they could just as easily be weaponized. In the eyes of those who might have orchestrated Tartaria's erasure, the safest course would be to remove all trace of its existence, to ensure that the knowledge was buried along with the buildings that once embodied it. But there may have been another reason, one less technological and more symbolic. If the Tartarians were, as some believe, a race of giants, beings larger and perhaps stronger than modern humans, then their continued presence in the historical record would fundamentally alter our understanding of ourselves. It would mean that humanity, as we are now, is not the sole intelligent species to have shaped the earth. It would raise uncomfortable questions about what happened to them and whether we are truly the pinnacle of evolution or simply the survivors of a contest we barely understand. In such a scenario, the erasure of Tartaria becomes not just a matter of hiding technology, but of protecting a fragile narrative. The idea that history is a steady, unbroken climb from primitive beginnings to modern mastery. To admit that there was once a civilization more advanced than ours possibly inhabited by beings different from us, would shatter that arc. It would force us to confront the possibility that progress is not inevitable, that civilizations can fall from great heights, and that we might be living in the shadow of one such fall without even realizing it. Economic control, political stability, and the preservation of a certain worldview, these are powerful incentives for rewriting history, and the 19th and early 20th centuries, with their revolutions, industrial booms, and global wars, provided the perfect cover for such a rewrite. In a time when entire cities could be destroyed and rebuilt in a matter of years, the disappearance of a civilization could be hidden in plain sight, folded into the chaos of modernization. For believers, the precision of Tartaria's removal is telling. Its name is not left to linger as a quaint anachronism, the way other outdated terms have survived. Its architecture is either destroyed, altered, or reattributed. Its possible artifacts are collected and locked away, their existence denied. Even its legends are scattered, rebranded as unrelated myths from different cultures. This is not the accidental forgetting of a distant past. It is the deliberate dismantling of an identity, leaving behind only fragments too disconnected to form a clear picture. And yet, those fragments endure. They survive in the old maps that escaped the revision, in the photographs that show more than they were meant to, in the buildings that still bear the proportions and designs of something older. They survive in the oral traditions of communities whose stories have never been fully written down. They survive, most stubbornly, in the questions that rise when someone notices a buried window, a foundation older than the building it supports, or a map that shows a land no longer named. If the erasure of Tartaria was intentional, then it is a testament to how thoroughly a narrative can be constructed and maintained. But it is also proof that no erasure is perfect. The past has a way of pushing through the cracks, of leaving signs for those willing to look. And the more people begin to see those signs, the harder it becomes to keep the story buried. Perhaps this is why, despite the skepticism and ridicule that often meet the theory, interest in Tartaria has grown in recent years. The digital age has made it harder to suppress anomalies. Old maps can be scanned and shared instantly. Photographs once hidden in archives can circulate freely. Small details that might once have gone unnoticed, a mismatched stone, a strange alignment, a missing record, can be discussed, analyzed, and compared with similar findings from across the world. Piece by piece, the fragments begin to form patterns again. And it is in those patterns that the danger lies for the official narrative. Because once enough people start to see the possibility of a different past, the questions will no longer be so easy to dismiss. They will demand answers, not just about Tartaria, but about how much of our history might have been rewritten to serve interests we will never see. The story of Tartaria might have stayed in the shadows forever, if not for a strange twist of timing: the rise of the digital age. In the 19th century, the erasure of a civilization could be managed by controlling maps, archives, and printing presses. In the 20th century, it could be maintained through school curricula, museum displays, and the steady repetition of an official narrative. But in the 21st century, something changed. Information, once slow and centralized, became fast, fragmented, and nearly impossible to contain. It began quietly. A photograph scanned from a forgotten book, a high-resolution image of an antique map posted online. A side-by-side comparison of buildings in different countries revealing uncanny similarities. At first, these anomalies appeared as isolated curiosities, shared on obscure forums and niche history blogs. But over time, they began to connect. Someone noticed that a basement window in a building in Budapest looked exactly like one in San Francisco. Someone else found a French map from the 1700s showing Grand Tartary in the same borders as a Dutch map from the same century. These scattered finds, pulled from attics, libraries, and auction sites, began to form a loose but growing archive. What makes this rediscovery movement different is that it is not driven solely by professional historians. In fact, many of the most detailed investigations come from people with no formal academic training, architects who recognize inconsistencies in building methods, engineers who question the logistics of 19th-century construction timelines, photographers who see signs of excavation in old images, linguists who notice how certain place names were changed or erased. Each brings a different skill set, and together they create a kind of decentralized research network, one that is harder to suppress because it has no single point of control. Social media accelerated the process. A photograph of a buried door can be seen by thousands in minutes. A video walking through the underground levels of a city can reach millions in days. Even those who dismiss the Tartarian theory entirely find themselves intrigued by the anomalies, the buried streets, the oversized doors, the old maps with vanished lands. And while skepticism remains strong, curiosity spreads faster. Every person who notices something strange in their own city becomes another potential contributor to the puzzle. This modern hunt for Tartaria mirrors, in some ways, the resistance to its original erasure. If the alleged cover-up relied on controlling the flow of information, the rediscovery relies on breaking that control. Where once maps could be hidden in a locked archive, they can now be scanned and preserved in digital collections accessible worldwide. Where once a photograph might have been filed away in a single library, it can now be replicated endlessly, immune to physical destruction. The very tools that make it possible to fabricate information also make it harder to erase. Of course, this has also created new challenges. The flood of digital content makes it easy for false leads and fabricated images to mix with genuine evidence. Some critics argue that the noise of misinformation drowns out the signal of real anomalies, making it easier to dismiss the entire theory as internet myth-making. But even in the noise, certain patterns keep surfacing, the kind that do not rely on dramatic claims, but on small, repeatable observations. Buried windows exist. Old maps show Tartaria. World's Fair buildings were demolished in suspiciously short time frames. These are not theories. They are facts that anyone can verify. The question is not whether they are real, but what they mean. In many ways, the rediscovery of Tartaria is as much about the present as the past. It forces people to confront how easily the story of the world can be shaped, and how much of what we believe rests on trust in historians, in institutions, in the idea that the past we are taught is complete. The theory challenges that trust, not always with definitive answers, but with the reminder that history is written by those who control the records. And once you understand that, you begin to wonder how many other chapters might be missing. The movement is still fragmented. still lacking the kind of centralized effort that could assemble all the scattered evidence into a coherent whole. But perhaps that is its strength. Without a single leader or institution, it cannot be shut down in one stroke. Every researcher, every amateur historian, every curious observer becomes a custodian of the fragments, passing them on, adding to them, building a collective archive that grows more difficult to erase with each passing year. Somewhere in all of this, there is a sense of quiet defiance, a refusal to let the past be closed and sealed by authority. The people searching for Tartaria are not content to be told what to think. They want to see for themselves, to walk the streets with new eyes, to compare the maps and the photographs, to ask the questions that polite history leaves alone. And whether or not Tartaria as imagined ever existed, the search itself has become a way of reclaiming something important: the right to question, to doubt, to imagine a different story than the one we have been given. In this sense, the modern rediscovery is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future, about deciding whether we accept the world as it is presented to us, or whether we dare to look beneath the surface, knowing we might find something that changes everything. Every movement that begins in the margins eventually reaches a crossroads, a moment when it either fades into obscurity or breaks through into the wider conversation. For the search for Tartaria, that tipping point may be closer than anyone expects. The clues have been scattered for decades, perhaps centuries, but now the speed and reach of digital communication have brought them together in a way that is harder to ignore. And once enough people see the same patterns, even if they interpret them differently, the conversation can no longer be contained to small corners of the internet. The shift would not happen all at once. It might start with a single high-profile discovery, an excavation revealing an entire buried street beneath a major city, or the accidental unearthing of a structure whose scale and craftsmanship defy its supposed age. It could be the rediscovery of an archive, forgotten in a library basement, containing photographs or documents that don't match the accepted history. Or perhaps it would be a leak, images or files from a museum or institution that confirm the existence of artifacts, or remains long rumored to have been hidden. When such a moment comes, the first reaction will likely be skepticism, followed by attempts to fold the discovery into the existing historical narrative. Experts will propose explanations: a misdated building, a local anomaly, an architectural quirk. The public, though, will remember the other anomalies they have already seen: the buried windows in their own city, the old maps with the name Tartaria, the photographs of World's Fair buildings demolished too soon. And in that moment, the isolated pieces may begin to connect in the collective imagination. For believers, this is the moment they have been waiting for, not because it proves everything they claim, but because it forces the broader world to acknowledge that something is missing from the official story. The debate will spill into mainstream media, with historians, architects, and engineers weighing in alongside amateur researchers and curious citizens. The questions will grow sharper. How much of what we know about the 19th century is actually true? Could entire civilizations have been erased before, their memory reduced to myth? And if so, who decides what we are allowed to remember? But such a tipping point would not be without resistance. Institutions that have built their authority on the completeness of the historical record would be reluctant to admit gaps, especially ones this large. Admitting that Tartaria, or something like it, existed would mean acknowledging that their predecessors either overlooked or deliberately concealed a civilization that shaped much of the world. That admission would ripple outward, undermining trust in other areas of scholarship and governance. If they could be wrong or deceptive about something this significant, what else might they have hidden? The reaction from the public would be just as complex. For some, the revelation would be exhilarating, proof that the world still holds deep mysteries, that our history is not a closed book. For others, it would be unsettling, even threatening. To accept that we might be living in the aftermath of a forgotten empire is to accept that the ground beneath us, literally and figuratively, is not as solid as we thought. And then there is the question of what happens next. If Tartarian architecture still stands in our cities, do we preserve it differently? If remnants of its technology are uncovered, do we attempt to revive it? And if so, under whose control? If remains of its people are found, whether giants or simply a different branch of humanity, do we integrate that knowledge into our understanding of ourselves, or does it become a source of division? The tipping point is not just about discovering the truth. It is about deciding what to do with it. Those who have been piecing together the puzzle for years understand this risk. They know that the moment the theory moves from fringe discussion to mainstream debate, it will be met with an equal measure of co-option and suppression. New narratives will emerge, some designed to explain away the anomalies without acknowledging the larger picture, others crafted to control the meaning of the discovery before the public can decide for itself. The fight will not only be over facts, but over interpretation. Yet, in a way, this is the inevitable path of any suppressed story. The longer it is kept hidden, the more explosive it becomes when it surfaces. If Tartaria is truly a missing chapter of our history, its reemergence will force a reckoning, not just with the past, but with the way we build, preserve, and share knowledge. It will challenge the authority of those who have shaped our understanding of history, and it will open the door to other possibilities we have been taught to dismiss. And maybe that is the true tipping point, not a single discovery, but the collective realization that history is not fixed, that it can be edited, erased, and rewritten, and that we have been living in the edited version. Once that realization takes hold, the search for Tartaria becomes something larger, a search for all the truths that have been buried under layers of convenience, control, and time. If Tartaria were to be rediscovered in its fullness, not as scattered anomalies, not as contested fragments, but as a clearly defined chapter of human history, the impact would be seismic. Entire fields of study would have to be rewritten. Archaeology, architecture, engineering, anthropology, even the story of our industrial age would shift under the weight of what had been hidden, and the changes would not remain confined to dusty textbooks. They would ripple outward into the way we see ourselves, our cities, and our future. Imagine walking through a city you thought you knew, only to learn that half of its landmarks were not the work of Victorian architects, but the preserved remnants of a civilization that predated the Industrial Revolution by centuries. The ornate stone facades, the grand domes, the vast train stations with ceilings impossibly high, all reinterpreted not as marvels of 19th century craftsmanship, but as inherited structures from a lost empire. A building you once passed every day without thought would suddenly feel alive with the weight of centuries, its walls holding secrets that no one had been allowed to speak of until now. Technology, too, would undergo a revolution. If Tartaria truly harnessed forms of energy we no longer use, wireless transmission, atmospheric electricity, resonant sound engineering, then rediscovering those methods could leapfrog over 2 centuries of fossil fuel dependency. It would not just mean cleaner power, it would mean a fundamental reshaping of economic systems built on scarcity. The industries that dominate the modern world, oil, coal, centralized electricity grids, could find themselves obsolete in a matter of years. The question would then become, who controls this reborn technology? Is it freely shared as a birthright of humanity, or is it hoarded by those with the means to exploit it? Beyond technology, the rediscovery of Tartaria could alter our sense of time itself. We are accustomed to thinking of progress as linear, each generation building on the last. But Tartaria would be proof that civilizations can rise to heights beyond our own, only to fall and be forgotten. It would force us to see history not as an upward staircase, but as a series of peaks and valleys, with long stretches of darkness between flashes of brilliance. Such a view could be humbling, a reminder that our current age is not invulnerable, that we too could be swept aside and buried, remembered only in fragments centuries from now. The psychological impact might be just as profound as the material. If the Tartarians were indeed a distinct people, whether giants, as some claim, or simply a culture with unique knowledge and values, then their rediscovery would challenge the idea that humanity's story belongs solely to us, the modern humans who remain. It would raise questions about our relationship to the past. Are we the inheritors of their wisdom, the usurpers of their lands, or simply the latest in a long line of civilizations destined to rise and fall? The political consequences could be unpredictable. Nations might compete to claim Tartarian heritage, seeking legitimacy or prestige in being linked to such a powerful lost civilization. Borders could be contested not just over territory, but over the right to own and interpret Tartarian sites and artifacts. International treaties might be needed to govern the excavation, preservation, and sharing of the knowledge uncovered. At the same time, groups that have long been marginalized could find new strength if Tartarian history validates their own oral traditions and ancestral claims. And then there is the question of faith. Religions might grapple with the implications of a lost civilization that defies their timelines or cosmologies. Some might embrace Tartaria as evidence of divine creation, while others might see it as a challenge to their foundational narratives. For those without religious belief, Tartaria might offer a new kind of origin story, one rooted not in myth, but in the tangible proof of a civilization that reshaped the earth long before our own. The rediscovery would also force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how knowledge is controlled. If Tartaria was erased, then it was not just nature that buried it, but people who made deliberate choices to hide it. Knowing this would erode trust in the institutions that claim to protect history, and it might inspire a new generation of independent researchers determined to guard against similar erasures in the future. The lesson would be clear. History does not belong to those who write it, but to those who preserve it, question it, and pass it on. In the streets, the shift might be subtler, but no less powerful. Tourist maps would be redrawn to mark newly recognized Tartarian sites. School children would take field trips to buildings that, only a year before, were thought to be the work of ordinary architects. Museums would open entire wings devoted to Tartarian artifacts, perhaps even housing working reconstructions of their technology. People would begin to see their own cities as layered palimpsests, modern life built over the bones of something older, richer, and more mysterious. And maybe, in time, the rediscovery of Tartaria would become more than a historical correction. It might serve as a reminder of what is possible, of how far human ingenuity can reach, and how fragile that achievement can be. In a world facing its own crises, climate change, political instability, the pressures of rapid technological change, Tartaria could be both a warning and an inspiration. A warning that even the greatest civilizations can fall, and an inspiration that greatness can rise again from what has been buried. In the end, perhaps the greatest power of the Tartarian story is not in whether it can be proven beyond all doubt, but in the way it changes the way we look at the world. Once you have heard it, once you have traced your finger over the faded outline of Grand Tartary on an old map or studied the photograph of a building with its lower windows half buried in earth, you cannot walk through your city the same way again. The ordinary begins to feel layered. Streets you once hurried down now seem like corridors built atop older corridors. Every archway, every dome, every strange detail carved into stone whispers a question. What came before? We live in an age that tells us the past is settled, that history is a completed work, bound and catalogued. But the idea of Tartaria reminds us that history is alive, that it can be revised, erased, and rediscovered. It tells us that the narrative we inherit is not always the whole story, and that what we call truth is often what survived the editing of time and power. And in that realization there is both unease and freedom. Unease, because it means the ground beneath our beliefs may not be solid. Freedom, because it means there are still mysteries left to chase. If Tartaria did exist, then somewhere beneath our feet lies the physical proof. Foundations that still hold their strength after centuries, machines whose purpose we have forgotten, inscriptions in languages we can no longer read. They may be buried under layers of soil or hidden in plain sight within the structures we use every day. And if it did not exist as imagined, then the fragments we have, the maps, the buildings, the photographs, are still reminders of how much of the past is strange, unexplained, and open to interpretation. Perhaps the truth lies in between. Perhaps there was no single unified empire called Tartaria, but a network of cultures that shared knowledge, technology, and aesthetics, bound together by trade and ideas, rather than a single ruler. Perhaps the name was a cartographer's shorthand for a vast and complex world, one that our historical records have simplified beyond recognition. If so, then the legend is still worth the chase, because it points us toward a richer, more tangled human story than the one we are usually told. The search for Tartaria is, at its heart, the search for what has been hidden. It is a refusal to accept that the story is finished, a belief that there is always more to uncover, more to understand. And that search is not limited to dusty archives or crumbling ruins. It happens in conversations between strangers, in photographs shared online, in the quiet moment when someone pauses in front of an old building and wonders why the ground floor is a few feet below the street. It happens whenever someone asks, "What if?" and refuses to let the question go unanswered. If there is a lesson here, it may be that we are all temporary custodians of history. What we know, we pass on. What we protect survives. And what we ignore vanishes, perhaps not forever, but long enough that future generations will have to dig for it, the way we now dig for Tartaria. The cycle will continue, as it always has. Civilizations will rise and fall. Some will be remembered, others will slip into shadow. And each time, the question will remain, who will tell their story? And who will decide which parts are left out? In the quiet hours of the night, when the streets are empty and the city feels older than the people who live in it, the mystery of Tartaria seems almost within reach. You can imagine the sound of footsteps on stone that is no longer exposed, the glow of lights powered by a system we no longer understand, the hum of a world that thrived before ours began. Whether those images are memories carried in the stones or simply the work of imagination, they have power. They make us see the present differently. And so the story continues, not just as a theory or a set of anomalies, but as an invitation to look closer at the places we think we know, to question the narratives we take for granted, to remember that the world is layered, and that beneath the surface of our everyday lives lie the traces of other times, other people, other possibilities. Maybe we will never know for certain what Tartaria truly was, but the search itself is a kind of treasure, a reminder that history is not a dead thing, but a living mystery. And as long as there are people willing to follow its faint, winding trail, the past will never be completely lost. Somewhere, in the stillness, a door remains half buried. A stone wall waits to be uncovered. An old map rests in a forgotten drawer. And perhaps one night, someone will find them, and the story will begin again. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to the search. Welcome to the part of history that refuses to sleep.